hard work, not just in cabinet, but also
proud member of Parliament for St. Boniface St. Vital. Kevin, thank you for your words as well. Sandra, Elder, thank you for starting us off in the right way. And thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight. This is really heartwarming to me to see so many people choosing to come out to engage in a political conversation. There's a lot of reasons to be skeptical or even cynical about politics, and all sorts of reasons to have lots of questions about what's going on and how, as a government and as politicians in general, we're responding to the things that matter most to you. But the fact that all of you who had other things to do on a random Wednesday evening chose to come out to be part of a conversation about where we're going as a country, as a community, how we're going to work together to make sure we're building the right future for all of us from coast to coast to coast, is a really encouraging thing, because there's so many reasons to be anxious, so many reasons to be worried about our future. I mean, when you think about what we've gone through in the past few years, it's absolutely unprecedented. The level of challenges we face, first of all, the ongoing challenge of climate change, but that is articulating itself with more and more extreme weather events. I don't have to talk to any Manitobans about flooding, but the wildfires we're seeing, the hurricane we saw just recently in Atlantic Canada, the challenges right across the country. Climate change is real, and it's having a huge impact on our lives, on our communities, and people are rightly worried about the fact that it's just going to get worse in its impacts over the coming decades. Then we went through a pandemic that threw us all for a loop, caused us to question a whole bunch of things, is still having lingering after effects, not just on our economy and on the challenges of supply chains and inflation, but also on our mental health, on how we're feeling about how we're in our communities, and exacerbated differences and challenges that people have faced when their worlds were turned upside down by things happening on the other side of the planet. We're also dealing with a moment of backsliding of democracy and rise of authoritarian states who are trying to disrupt those democracies. No better example of that than Russia choosing to overturn decades of stability, of a UN charter, of a rules-based international order that said the lines on a map are the lines on a map and you don't get to redraw them by force, and chose to invade a peaceful neighbor. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, you know, it's just a war in Europe. We should be worried about wars everywhere in the world, not just in Europe. But this is a direct challenge to the foundational principles upon which our peace and prosperity everywhere around the world is based right now. Russia is trying to make it so that might becomes right once again. And if you think for a second of any corner of the world where there's a slightly larger neighbor with a slightly larger military looking at a line on a map that was drawn perhaps in a slightly arbitrary way by colonial powers, and saying actually the people on the other side of that river or that other side of that mountain range or that little island there really should belong to our country. And suddenly you get a potential for chaos in the world that we have to stand up against. That's why 141 countries around the world stood up in support of Ukraine at the UN, because this is larger than just Ukraine, but it's very much about Ukraine. That we need to continue to stand with Ukraine, stand against Russia, stand against the violation of the UN Charter, and that's also a cause for concern. It's having an impact on food prices and energy prices and constant disruption of global supply chains. So there's a lot coming at us. Right now we're looking at a global economic slowdown at a time where we're still strained on all sorts of different levels. No wonder people are worried about where we're going, about how we're going to get through it. Housing prices are through the roof. Groceries still remain stubbornly high, even as inflation is coming down. And There's a search now for easy answers, for simplistic solutions. Une solution facile qui va tout régler. Un tweet bien tourné. Une vidéo sur TikTok ou sur YouTube qui va tout expliquer. If any of the answers were simple, they'd already have been brought into place. Complex problems, complex challenges have complex solutions and require us all to step up, require us to work hard together to solve them. But the good thing is, that's what Canadians have always been great at. Figuring out how to roll up our sleeves, lean on each other, work together for the betterment of our community and our country, and make it through incredibly difficult challenges. We do that every year. It's called winter. We know how to get through tough times. That's what Canada is. And the ability to remain clear-eyed and optimistic about our future is part of what I wanted to talk with you about tonight. But I'm not going to say much more right now because I'm really looking forward to taking questions from as many of you as I possibly can. So I'm going to try and keep my answers short. I'm terrible at keeping my answers short, but I promise you I will try, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. I'm going to start in this section here, and then I'll just loop my way around the room, and we'll start with that. So does someone have a question for me in this section here? Et bien sûr, vous pouvez poser vos questions en anglais ou en français si vous en avez. Go ahead, ma'am. And what's your name?
Sorry, my name is Billy. First of all, I want to say I'm very proud of you. I'm proud of who you've become. I watched your mom and I watched your dad, and I'm really, really proud of your leadership. I want to commend you for that first. So my question isn't an easy one, and I know it's probably one that you've been challenged with probably in the past. We have another kind of pandemic happening across this country, actually internationally, and that is the loss of lives from addictions. And we face a death here every minute. Every minute there's somebody that's dying from an overdose. And it doesn't matter what cities you go into, what communities. It used to be that there was a stigma that those things were attached to certain families, but now they're in everybody's families and they're in everybody's homes. And it's tragic. What is leadership for a country as well-versed and prominent as ours? What does that look like?
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you, Billy. And you're right that these are tragedies that have hit every family in every part of the country, in every neighborhood. But we also have to know that, as usual, with any crisis or with any huge challenge, it's hitting the most vulnerable hardest. And that's where we really have to start and step up. But nobody is untouched by challenges of addictions, of opioids, of these challenges. I think the first thing is making sure that we understand there is no one answer to it. There is no simple solution. When you look at addictions, even before you start talking about the ways of treating the addictions, we have to understand so often it comes from cycles of trauma, of marginalization, the social determinants of health, housing, employment, a sense of value, identity, language, particularly when you talk about Indigenous peoples who've lost their connection with their ancestors, their elders, their identity, their core because of residential schools and other things that have tried to take away. That leaves people more vulnerable to addictions. So we need to be working on those, whether it's with eliminating boil water advisories, investing in partnerships and self-government and economic reconciliation, all those things are part of it. But if we're going to get down to the actual challenge of addictions, it's time we stopped treating addiction as a criminal justice issue and dealt with it as a health issue. And I'll be honest, that's tough right now. That's tough right now because people are scared. People look at increasing violence in public transit, in cities across the country, so much of it tied to mental health challenges, so much of it tied to criminal justice systems, overworked and churning through, some of which is tied as well to poverty. And it's easy to sort of say, okay, you know, we just need to keep with the criminal justice and keep punishing people and keep them out of society, if on the margins of society, if, you know, they are addicted and unable to be helped. Well, that's the wrong approach. Years and decades of trying variations on that has only made it worse. So we do have to be grounded in science and evidence. And whether it's safe consumption sites or harm reduction programs, looking at what the best data and the best research is into how to help people from staying away from the toxic drug supplies that are out there. Being an addict shouldn't be a death sentence. Unfortunately, it's close to that now in some parts of the country where the availability of toxic drugs is a huge problem. And unfortunately, here's an example where, you know, there are some politicians who are falling back on simple common sense and fear and say, well, you know, these are just bad people, or you know, the approach doesn't work because unfortunately it's continuing and it hasn't, harm reduction hasn't worked. Well, it has. It is saving lives, and we need to continue to be grounded in a responsible, evidence-based, science-based, not an ideological, not a populist, popular approach to it, but a compassionate, scientific, health-based approach to dealing with addictions, even as we work on the international stage to interdict the flow of drugs, whether it's fentanyl or carfentanil or others, whether it's making sure we're strengthening our border measures, whether it's making sure, I mean, there's a broad range of approaches we have to take to it, and this government's going to continue to do that, but we will, every step of the way, be grounded in two principles: compassion and science. Thank you very much. Thank you, Billy. Another question? Yes, you, go ahead.
Alors, bonsoir, Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Bonsoir.
Mon nom c'est Marie-Paul. So, I am the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students in Manitoba, and I wanted to ask a question. So, we all saw that the government actually temporarily allowed international students to work more than 20 hours, and I think we can all see, I guess the KPI and the metric will show that it actually helped the Canadian workforce, because we already have like people on ground who have like Canadian experience and all of that working right away in different industry, whether it's like healthcare or anything else we can think about. So my first question will be, it's a question in with two wings, if I can call it like that. So the first one will be, will the government consider making this a permanent measure? And the second one is, will the government consider creating, let's say, a PR pathway that is very comprehensive for people in Canada? What I mean by that is that when you apply for PR, there are different, let's say, I call them barriers because this is what they are. For people that already live here, for instance, they have to take a language test. And for me, it's like somebody that's been living in Canada for so long, at least speaks English or French. I do speak both. So I don't really see maybe the reason why we still have like the language test that is there, knowing that it costs like anywhere between $300 and plus, like $300 to $400. So that's another barrier that make people kind of hold on to applying for PR. So I think it would be great if we can look into that, because we already have the workforce on ground. They have the experience. They are qualified, studied in, well-renowned Canadian universities. So that's something that we can explore. So wanted to know if that would be an option. Merci beaucoup.
Ça me fait plaisir. Merci. Merci, merci pour la question. International students should all have pathways to citizenship. It just makes sense. Someone like we need to continue to welcome in people from around the world to continue to grow our economy. One of the advantages Canada has over other G7 nations is we actually have a growing population at a faster rate because Canadians remain positively inclined towards immigration. Canadians understand that immigration creates jobs, creates prosperity. Even when you talk about the housing crisis that we're facing, which we are facing, one of the limits on creating more housing is the challenges on having enough construction workers, and immigration could be a solution to that as well when we bring in skilled workers and skilled trades. So we need more immigration, and international students have Canadian experience. They've been here for a while. They've gone through our education system by definition, so they have relevant skills, and they already have a place to live if they're in Canada. I mean, they're already here. There's no travel. So we are absolutely accelerating and strengthening pathways to permanent residency for international students. The other part of it around expanding workplace opportunities and hours of work, we're always trying to get that balance right. International students should be able to contribute, but we do want to make sure that that you're coming here as an international student to study, and it's not a backdoor way of getting a work permit. So there have to be certain limits around that. And that's sort of a theme that goes through our immigration system, that one of the things that I think is really important to protect as a country is the fact that Canadians are positively inclined towards immigration. And one of the ways of guaranteeing that is to show that we have a strong system that applies, that is fair, and that is applied across the country in rigorous ways. And when people know that immigration is done in a responsible or super positive about it, and that's what we need, and that's a comparative advantage that Canada has over other countries where people are turning their back on immigration, even at a time where the entire world is facing labor shortages in all sorts of ways. It's just less in Canada because we can continue to draw on people. Stand up.
Hello, welcome to Winnipeg. My name is Victoria Romero. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Manitoba, a social justice activist, and I also just completed my term as the Vice President Advocacy at the University of Manitoba Students' Union.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. And through this work, I work directly to urge all levels of government to address the ongoing mental health crisis. In 2021, the Liberals made a platform promise to create a fund of $500 million over 4 years for post-secondary mental health supports. And while we've seen a lot of great policy around mental health from this government, this specific one has yet to be fulfilled. I was just wondering, what is the plan to address this and fulfill this promise to create this mental health fund for students?
Well, thank you, Victoria. You know, one of the things that has always impacted me the most since I've been doing these town halls since before I was Prime Minister, but consistently, every town hall I get a question on mental health, usually early on, and almost always from a young person. It is young people who are driving the conversation around mental health, around destigmatization, around dealing with it, and you need to be supported and saluted in that. Thank you for that advocacy. It's really, really important. Mental health is health. For too long, our healthcare systems have segmented out or looked at an institutional model around mental health when we know that engaging in a comprehensive way, particularly around young people, is incredibly important. If you can support someone in the 15 to 25-year-old range as they begin, in many cases, their first struggles with mental health, then you give them the tools to be more successful, more achieving their potential, more able to deal with those challenges throughout the course of their life. And that's why we specifically targeted supporting in universities and moving forward on that. We have brought forward certain programs around universities, but the large thing that we always run into as a federal government is the federal government's not in charge of delivery of health care. Those are the provinces. And the federal government has two big roles around health. One is to participate in the funding of healthcare services across the country. And two is to make sure that healthcare right across the country follows the principles and the guidelines of the Canada Health Act, which means public, universally accessible services across the country. We need to have a public healthcare system in this country. So after the pandemic, where we saw that there were such challenges around delivery of healthcare right across the country, that the pandemic exacerbated, we realized that we needed to encourage results from healthcare delivery across the country. Now, the way our country works doesn't mean, the federal government is the boss of the provinces, or the boss of the municipalities, and so forth. We're not hierarchical. The federal government and the provincial governments deal with different things within the Constitution, and I don't get to tell the Premier what to do in provincial areas of jurisdiction. So we have to figure out other ways of doing it. One of the things we did earlier this year, when we were close to $200 billion in healthcare funding over the next 10 years, is instead of holding strings on it, which would be unconstitutional or the wrong way of going about it, we demanded a level of transparency and accountability, not to us, but to Canadians, with proper data collection, proper metrics,